Hi, my name is Stephanie and I'm a PhD student from the University of Sydney, and today my presentation is going to look at invisible and visible disability representation in the Girls Make Your Move Instagram campaign, where invisible disability is just a special, albeit more common case of disability where disability is just not clearly visually signified. So for those of you who aren't aware of the Girls Make Your Move campaign, it was an Australian national health campaign that was run by the Australian Department of Health from 2016 to 2019. It aimed to inspire young females aged 12 to 24 to engage in more physical activity. And although it didn't explicitly include females with disability, the campaign did paint itself as a very inclusive and diverse campaign that aimed to inspire all females regardless of ethnicity, size, or ability. Specifically, the campaign was run online for the most part, consisting of a website and various social media accounts, one of which was the Instagram account. In terms of method, I used a qualitative content analysis, which involved me coding all 1,463 posts on the @GirlsMakeYourMove Instagram account. I specifically coded for the representation of disability and then focused on the subset of posts that represented disability and recoded for prominent trends, such as the prominence of invisible and visible disability. When it came to theoretical framework, I used Economies of Visibility, which is a lens that I adapted from feminist media studies to examine the representation and visibility given to different disabled bodies. In short, the lens argues that all bodies are commodities that are constantly being traded in these markets of visibility, where each body's value or worth is determined by its ability to signify particular identities visually. So it works in that really problematic assumption that we can reduce identities to visual binaries. So in the case of disability, that would be the disabled-bodied, able-bodied binary. And the underlying logic is that certain bodies with certain visible differences are more highly valued commodities in particular media contexts, and as a result, that bolsters their representation and visibility. In the case of the Girls Make Your Move campaign, Mitchell and Snyder's contention that bodies with visible differences are highly valued due to the increase in diversity initiatives is particularly relevant, because that diversity initiative market that they describe is the one that the Girls Make Your Move campaign operates in. So in terms of results, out of the 1,463 posts on the Girls Make Your Move account, only 78 posts represented disability, out of which 40 posts represented visible disability and 31 posts represented invisible disability, keeping in mind that a number of posts couldn't be coded as either. A post was coded as representing disability if it visually included a person with disability, or if it tagged a person with disability or an organisation that predominantly works with people with disability, or if it explicitly included the word disability or another specific type of disability in the caption or overlaid in the image. So I adopted a very wide understanding of representation that included both textual and visual representation. However, in this particular presentation, I'm only going to focus on visual representation. In terms of visual representation of disability, all 40 posts that represented visible disability visually. So they all used the exact same strategy, which was including a person with visible disability in the visual aspect of the post. Whereas when it came to invisible disability, only 19 of the 31 posts represented invisible disability visually, with 16 of these posts including a person with invisible disability and the remaining 3 posts overlaying the word depression onto an image, which just goes to show how difficult it is to represent invisible disability, especially keeping in mind that a number of the posts that included a person with invisible disability relied on the viewer having some prior knowledge of that person having invisible disability. In terms of interesting trends, 4 prominent themes emerged across the posts that represented disability. However, I'm only going to focus on the 2 most prominent themes, which were the Paralympics theme, which 29 posts were coded under, and the females in wheelchair theme, which 25 posts were coded under. For a post to be coded under the Paralympics theme, it had to either visually or textually include a Paralympian or the Paralympics, and for a post to be coded under the females in wheelchair theme, it had to visually include a female in a wheelchair. Often they were playing a sport or were a well-known athlete. The Paralympic theme in particular had some really interesting trends, namely that 15 of the posts represented visible disability, and 14 of the posts represented invisible disability, with 13 of those posts including a person with invisible disability. Additionally, 23 of the 29 posts were also regrams, and 25 of the 29 posts included a Paralympian. Perhaps of most interest, though, was the fact that only 3 posts overlapped between the Paralympics theme and the females in wheelchair theme, which means that both themes together made up the majority of posts that represented disability. When it comes to interpreting these results, in my paper I draw on economies of visibility and begin to think about the different markets of visibility that the Girls Make Your Move campaign operates within. However, given the limited time in this presentation, I'm only going to briefly sketch out the basic market components of goods, supply and demand in order to tease out how thinking about these market components can help us better understand and scrutinize the visibility and representation assigned to different disabled bodies. In terms of the Girls Make Your Move campaign, we can argue that the demand stems from the campaign's desire to encourage its target audience to engage in more physical activity. Specifically, there was likely some government pressure to include females with disability in the campaign, given that the campaign's evaluation reports specifically measure the effectiveness of the campaign on females with disability. Although there is very limited discussion on these results, this perhaps suggests that there was some demand for disability inclusion, albeit very low, and that goes some way in explaining why only 78 of the 1,463 posts across the campaign actually represent disability. Additionally, as I noted earlier, the campaign works in a diversity initiative market, which values bodies with visible differences. So we can read the invisibly disabled body and visibly disabled body as 2 goods that are competing for visibility within this market, whereby the visibly disabled body is the preferred body for representation, namely because it doesn't trouble the visual binary that underlies disability, unlike the invisibly disabled body. And that again goes some way in explaining why there was higher visual representation of visible disability across the campaign. When it comes to thinking about the supply, it's useful to draw on the 2 most prominent themes as they make up the majority of posts that represent disability. So these themes were the Paralympics, whereby 25 of the 29 posts were of Paralympians, and the females in wheelchair theme, which again just reflects how high the demand was for the visibly disabled body. When we think about both these themes in conjunction, they point to the very narrow way that we tend to imagine females with disability in a sporting context, namely as either a Paralympian or a female in a wheelchair playing sport, which is very problematic in and of itself. However, when we think about the Paralympics theme exclusively, it also probes us to question whether there was any meaningful intent to include people with invisible disability within the campaign, because 13 of the 16 posts that include people with invisible disability actually appear within the Paralympics theme, which is predominantly made up of regrams from other accounts, with 23 of the 29 posts specifically being regrams, which means that the content wasn't created specifically for the inclusion within this campaign. And that sparks questions as to whether people with invisible disability were meaningfully included within this campaign, or if they were just included as part of perhaps meeting a government quota for disability inclusion. All in all, this study reinforces how narrowly we tend to imagine the disabled sporting body, and this is especially troubling in the context of the Girls Make Your Move campaign, which not only portrayed itself in an inclusive and diverse light, but also actively used regramming as a strategy to source content, which means that they could have regrammed from more niche disability sporting communities and portrayed a more inclusive image of people with disability. This study also probes a number of interesting questions, not only how do we visually represent people with invisible disability, but also how do we encourage more representation of people with invisible disability in a meaningful and inclusive way. It also probes questions around the diversity initiative market that I talked about, and whether other minority groups were represented in a meaningful way, and how that representation stacks up against the way people with disability have been represented in the campaign. Overall, these are some of the questions that I'm also hoping to grapple with across my PhD. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the organisers for organising such an exciting pre-conference.